You may think you know this story. You wouldn't be alone. They reduce it to a warning about disbelief or a tale of divine spite. They forget that the gods of old were not gentle. They forget that mortals who brushed against them seldom survived unchanged. Cassandra was not simply cursed. She was marked. Once a god takes notice of you, the world bends around that attention. Her mind did not open to the future. It tore, and something stepped through. Walk carefully now. This is not the version sung by poets. This is the one whispered by whatever is left of her. Long before the fall of Troy, long before Helen set foot upon its shores, and long before any prophecy was spoken, Cassandra began to hear the voices that lived within the palace walls. At first, they arrived as the faintest murmurs, thin threads of sound that slipped beneath her door at night and curled softly around her ear. They never formed recognizable words, yet each whisper carried the unmistakable weight of meaning. It was cold, ancient, and never meant for mortal understanding. When she tried to explain this to her mother, she said simply that the palace seemed to be breathing. Her mother smiled with gentle dismissal and told her she was imagining things, as children often do. But the voices did not vanish with reassurance. They gathered instead. Every corridor seemed to whisper when she passed. Every column gave off a low, unsettling hum. Every shadow lingered just a moment too long, stretching its shape as though it watched her from just beyond the frame of her vision. Cassandra felt the presence of these whispers even when she closed her eyes, especially when she closed her eyes. Darkness only sharpened the sensation of being observed, of being recognized by something that had waited far longer than she had lived. And somewhere deep within the oldest chambers of the temple, behind stone that had stood for centuries, something ancient stirred in answer to her awareness. It followed the sound of her footsteps, listened to the rhythm of her breath, and leaned closer to the thinning veil through which she had begun unknowingly to see. As the days passed, Cassandra became increasingly aware that the presence within the palace was not content to remain hidden. It revealed itself not through sudden apparitions or violent signs, but through a gradual sharpening of the world around her, as though the air itself was learning to breathe in new rhythms. Shadows deepened when she entered a room, stretching softly along the walls as though reaching toward her. The stone floors, once cool and inert beneath her bare feet, carried a faint vibration, a pulse that matched neither the wind nor the distant sea, but something older and far more deliberate. At times, she would pause in the middle of a hallway, compelled by a sensation that someone or something was standing just behind her shoulder. When she turned, she found nothing but the familiar architecture of the palace, unchanged and serene. Yet the lingering shiver down her spine told her she had not been alone. Servants occasionally glanced her way with quiet unease, noticing how she tilted her head to listen to sounds they could not hear, or how she traced her fingertips along the grooves in a stone column as though deciphering a message hidden within it. The whispers did not frighten her, though perhaps they should have. Instead, they seemed to draw her forward, guiding her toward the deeper chambers of the temple where the air was heavy with incense and the echoes of ancient rituals hung like invisible tapestries. The priests often warned children not to wander. Those rooms belonged to the gods alone, but Cassandra felt no fear crossing the threshold. The shadows parted for her, curling back into the corners as if making room. Here the voices were clearer. They did not speak in words, but in impressions of flashes of insight, tremors of emotion, and the sensation of standing on the edge of something immense. Cassandra would stand for long minutes in the half-darkness, her small hands folded in front of her, listening to the silent chorus thrumming in the stone. Sometimes she sensed a consciousness moving behind the whispers, something vast and luminous, brushing the edges of her thoughts like a hand trailing across water. It did not announce itself, nor did it seek permission to draw near. It simply observed her at first curiously, then with growing intent. Cassandra could not have known then that the boundary between mortal and divine had already begun to thin around her. She only knew that she felt watched, not with malice, but with a strange hunger, as though the very walls of the temple had awakened and were studying her in return. And each time she walked away from those chambers, she felt the gaze follow her, patient and unblinking, waiting for the moment she would finally understand what had chosen her. The signs of that hidden presence gathered slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, like dust settling in the corners of a forgotten room. Cassandra noticed temple lights flickering without wind, when the braziers burned hotter as she passed, when a priest would stop mid-sentence and glance around with the uneasy sense that something unseen had crossed the room. They dismissed these interruptions with nervous laughter, but Cassandra felt each one settle deep inside her, as though the world had begun to move around her rather than with her. It was not only the temple that changed. The palace itself seemed to respond to her growing awareness. She would walk through the colonnades and feel a tremor in the stone, a subtle tightening beneath her steps, as though the structure braced itself with anticipation. Servants whispered that the air grew colder when she entered a room, but Cassandra only felt warmth. It was a warmth that curled at the edges of her thoughts, coaxing her deeper into the mystery she had not asked for. Nights became the strangest of all. She would wake suddenly, not from nightmares, but from the undeniable sensation of being summoned. The moonlight cast long shapes across her floor, and often she found herself standing before her door, without remembering how she rose from her bed. The corridors of the palace stretched endlessly in the dim hours, guiding her toward the temple like a river flowing to the sea. She followed, not because she understood, but because resisting felt impossible, like trying to stop the tide with her bare hands. Upon entering the temple, the silence would greet her like an old companion. The shadows that once remained motionless now shifted with purpose, folding over themselves, gathering form without ever settling into a clear shape. Cassandra felt no fear. Something within her recognized this presence, as if some hidden part of her had always belonged to it. She stepped closer to the inner sanctum, where only priests were meant to tread. The air shimmered faintly, as though suffused with heat, though the stone beneath her feet remained cool. A soft radiance, pale and quivering, clung to the far wall. At first she believed it to be reflected torchlight, but the torches were unlit. The glow pulsed once, then again, expanding and contracting with the slow rhythm of breath. Cassandra's own breathing matched it without her willing it so. Her chest rose and fell in unison with the flickering light, their movements entwined like two strings plucked by the same hand. Something luminous moved within the radiance, not yet a figure, not yet a god, but an expression of awareness. Cassandra felt its gaze press gently upon her mind. The sensation was neither cold nor warm. It was simply vast, an enormity brushing against her small existence, with a careful, almost curious restraint. The whispers she had heard for so long now converged into a single resonance, a deep, thrumming note that settled into her bones. It was not speech, but it carried meaning nonetheless, an invitation she did not fully understand, but could not turn away from. Cassandra stepped closer, drawn by the trembling air, the shimmering light. the sense that something extraordinary was preparing to cross the threshold between the unseen and the visible. She did not know that this moment was the first breath of the divine settling upon her life. She could not yet comprehend that the presence gathering itself before her was shaping her fate with every beat of light. But the gods are patient when they choose their instruments. And Apollo, though not yet revealed, had already begun to claim her. Cassandra returned to the temple again the following night, though she could not have explained what compelled her. She moved through the corridors as though she walked inside a dream crafted by someone else, her footsteps guided by a purpose older than her own thoughts. The torches were unlit, the palace resting in soft silence. Yet the path before her felt illuminated by something she could not see. Each breath carried her forward until she reached the threshold of the inner chamber, a place mortals rarely entered willingly. The air within the sanctuary felt different from any other room in Troy. It was thicker, heavier, charged with a tension that made the fine hairs on her arms rise. She stepped inside slowly, letting her eyes adjust to the delicate glow that clung to the walls. The strange radiance she had seen before pulsed again, as though acknowledging her arrival. It gathered itself in quiet increments, each movement subtle but unmistakably deliberate, drawing her attention and refusing to release it. This time the light did not remain a shapeless shimmer. It elongated, stretching upward like a flame rekindling after a long rest. Cassandra stood before it, unable to look away, her breath caught between awe and fear. The glow twisted inward, spiraling into a coherent form, limbs, shoulders, the faint suggestion of a face not yet fully shaped. The air crackled with a shimmering pressure that made her chest tighten. She realized with a sudden rush of understanding that she was standing in the presence of something not born of mortal realms. As the figure sharpened, the whispers she had always heard shifted. They rose from a murmur into a resonance, weaving through the chamber with the timbre of a chant, like thousands of ancient voices layered atop one another, speaking in unison without forming a single earthly word. Cassandra felt them inside her mind, vibrating through her bones, as though her very thoughts had been submerged in a river of sound. The figure stepped closer, no, not stepped, glided forward, with a movement that simply erased the distance between them. The glow dimmed slightly, revealing a silhouette of almost human proportions. A face emerged, though it was not a mortal face. Its beauty was sharp, impossible, as if sculpted from light rather than flesh. Gold radiated from its skin in subdued flickers, like sunlight passing through water. Yet the eyes were vast and ancient, holding the weight of centuries in their quiet depths. "Cassandra," the figure said, though its lips hardly moved. The name echoed within her, vibrating through her like a plucked string. It was not spoken, it was known. She staggered backward, but the chamber held her in place. Her heart hammered in her chest as she struggled to steady herself, aware that something monumental was unfolding before her. This impossible presence knew her name, knew her essence, as intimately as if it had been watching her since the day she was born. "You have heard me," the voice continued, growing clearer with each syllable. "And now you will see." The light surged outward, engulfing her. Cassandra cried out, though whether in fear or wonder she could not tell. Her knees gave way beneath her, yet she did not fall. The radiance held her aloft, suspending her in a moment that felt both infinite and no longer tethered to time. Her vision blurred, then shattered open like glass breaking under pressure. She saw fire. A city is collapsing. Screams tearing through the smoke, the sea swallowing bodies, soldiers emerging from shadow. Her own voice crying out warnings that crumbled before they reached listening ears. The vision consumed her. It was too much, too vivid, too violent, too certain. She felt her mind splitting under the weight of it, as if the truth of what she witnessed was too vast to exist inside a single human consciousness. She gasped for breath, clawing at the air as though she could push the images away, but they pressed closer, searing themselves into her memory. And then, as abruptly as it began, the vision receded. Cassandra collapsed onto the cold stone floor, trembling. Her heart raced with the lingering terror of what she had seen. Above her, the radiance dimmed, gathering once more into the form of the god, Apollo. He gazed down at her with a mixture of triumph and something that hovered between admiration and possession. "You understand now," he said, his voice drifting through her like smoke. "I have opened your sight." But Cassandra could not answer. She lay gasping, overwhelmed, still feeling the echoes of the burning future clawing at the edges of her mind. The god's glow brightened in acknowledgement of her fear, though he made no move to retreat. "Do not tremble," he said. "This is only the beginning." Cassandra spent the remainder of the night trembling beside the cold stone altar, unable to calm the storm inside her mind. The vision had seared itself into her memory so completely that she could no longer distinguish between what she had seen in the future and what stood before her in the present. Every sound in the temple seemed to echo with a faint, lingering threat, as though the walls themselves carried the afterimage of what Apollo had forced her to witness. By the time dawn approached, her fear had hardened into desperation. She needed to tell someone what she had seen. The images still pulsed behind her eyes, violent and relentless, and the certainty of their truth pressed down upon her chest like a weight she could not bear alone. She rose unsteadily, gripping the edge of a stone column for balance, and stumbled out of the temple into the pale morning light. The servants had begun their duties, moving quietly through the palace courtyard. Cassandra walked toward them, though each step felt heavier than the last, as though invisible threads were tugging her back toward the temple, reminding her to whom she now belonged. She forced herself forward. Her mother was arranging offerings near the fountain, her expression calm and untroubled. Cassandra approached her with trembling hands and wide, fevered eyes. The moment her mother turned, Cassandra's voice broke from her in a rush. "I saw it," she whispered. "Mother, I saw the city burning. I saw the smoke choking the sky. I saw soldiers inside our walls. Everything was falling. Everything was ending. You must listen." "I saw." But her mother's gaze changed almost immediately, concern softening into something more hesitant, more uncertain. Cassandra's urgent words, which rang with clarity and terror in her own ears, seemed to falter in the air before reaching the older woman. Her mother blinked at her, struggling to follow, her brow furrowing with confusion rather than understanding. "Cassandra, slow down, child. You're shaking. You must have had a nightmare." "No," Cassandra insisted, reaching for her mother's arm. "It wasn't a dream. It was real. It was the future. You must believe me, please, you must believe me." But the more she pleaded, the stranger her mother's expression became. Instead of hearing the truth, she heard only fragments. A hurried breath, a trembling urgency, tones that tremored with fear but conveyed nothing coherent. Words that should have formed warnings now jumbled together, slipping from Cassandra's tongue as disjointed sounds. Her mother placed both hands on Cassandra's cheeks, trying to calm her. "You're frightened, that's all. The night plays tricks on the mind." "No," Cassandra said again, her voice cracking. "You aren't hearing me. Why aren't you hearing me?" But her mother was hearing her. Only the meaning had been stolen. A cold realization rippled through Cassandra, chilling her to the marrow. She opened her mouth again, desperate to force sense into her words, desperate to make herself understood. But what emerged sounded like the broken remnants of a story. Its choked snippets, trembling half-thoughts, the language of someone overwhelmed by fears she could not name. It was as if her voice had been uprooted and replanted in barren soil. Cassandra stepped back, her breath quickening. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "This is wrong. This isn't what I'm saying. Why can't you hear me?" Her mother reached for her, trying to reassure her, but Cassandra pulled away. She felt the curse tightening, coiling around her like an invisible serpent. The god's voice echoed faintly in her memory. "Your sight is mine." And now she understood the part he had not spoken aloud. "Your voice is no longer yours." The temple whispers had not chosen her for clarity. They had chosen her for silence. Cassandra sank to her knees as the weight of this truth settled over her like a funeral shroud. She pressed her hands to her mouth as though she could force her words back into meaning, back into coherence, back into anything that might save her. But the curse had already taken root, and no matter how clearly she saw the future, no one, not even those she loved, would ever truly hear her again. This was how her fate began. The palace resumed its steady rhythm in the days that followed, but Cassandra felt as though she were moving through a world that no longer shared her reality. Servants carried baskets of figs and dates to the kitchens. Soldiers strode through the courtyard with spears balanced on their shoulders, and her brothers laughed together as they prepared for their morning duties. All of it felt impossibly distant. The light of the sun seemed dimmed, as if Apollo's radiance had washed the colors of the world into a pale imitation of itself. Cassandra tried again to speak of her vision. She first sought out her brother Deiphobus, who was always patient with her. She found him near the training grounds, polishing the edge of a sword. She approached with careful steps, rehearsing her words in her mind so that they would be calm, steady, and clear. Once she began to speak, however, the same distortion rose between her intention and her speech. Deiphobus turned toward her, but the concern in his face deepened with every sentence she attempted to form. He heard her fear. He heard her urgency. Yet he did not hear the truth she was trying to deliver. Her descriptions of smoke and falling towers tangled themselves on her tongue. Her voice trembled with sincerity, but the words themselves carried no sense. Deiphobus placed a firm hand on her shoulder. He told her to rest. He told her she was overtired. He told her that she needed quiet and calm, not prophecy. Cassandra stepped back, stunned by the completeness of the barrier separating her from understanding. She could feel the shape of her own thoughts perfectly, but once they crossed the space from her mind to her mouth, they unraveled like threads pulled from a tapestry. Her vision was intact. Her voice was not. Over the next several days, she sought counsel from the priests of Apollo, believing that they, among all people in Troy, might sense the truth in the divine energy that clung to her. She knelt before them in the temple and explained the terror that filled her sleep and the visions that consumed her waking hours. The priests listened politely, but their faces revealed only confusion and discomfort. Her prophecy made no sense to them. Her words did not align with the discipline of their sacred texts. They offered prayers, but no understanding. Cassandra left the temple with her heart weighted by a growing fear. If the priests of Apollo could not understand her, then no one in Troy would. The god's curse had taken hold with a precision that demonstrated a cruel perfection. It allowed her to see, but it denied her the power to be heard. She spent her evenings wandering the palace gardens, seeking quiet places where she could breathe without feeling the suffocating press of the future against her mind. The more she tried to ignore the visions, the more relentless they became. They flickered at the edges of her sight like sparks dancing on the wind. She saw smoke rising behind the palace towers. She saw soldiers fighting on the steps of the temple. She saw her family in states of anguish she could not bear to witness. Each vision felt like a truth carved into the world before anyone knew to fear it. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and the sky turned the color of old bronze, Cassandra found herself standing near the highest vantage point of the palace. From there, she could see the city stretching below her, full of life and movement. Children played in the streets. Merchants called out the prices of olive oil and honey. Women carried jars of water from the well. It was a city at peace, confident in its walls and in the favor of its gods. She felt an ache in her chest at the sight. The visions of fire pressed forward in her mind, sharper and more violent than ever. The cries of the future rose around her, drowning out the gentle sounds of daily life. She gripped the stone railing until her fingers ached. "How can I save them?" she whispered to herself, "if no one can hear me?" The question hung in the air, unanswered and heavy with its own certainty. She felt a familiar warmth gathering behind her, the subtle shift of the world that signaled the presence of the god. She turned slowly, expecting to see the figure of Apollo materializing from the golden light. Instead, she saw her reflection in the darkened window behind her. Her eyes looked different now. They held a depth that had not existed before, a heavy knowledge that no child should carry. Her face looked older, marked not by age but by understanding. In that moment, she recognized something irrevocable. She was no longer a girl seeking answers in the quiet corners of the temple. She had become a vessel for a future that no one wished to believe. A single truth settled over her with the finality of stone. She would see every calamity that approached Troy, but she would face them alone. And the gods who claimed to guide the world would not offer her mercy. They had given her sight, and they had taken everything else. Several weeks passed before the first sign of approaching disaster reached the gates of Troy. A ship appeared on the horizon one morning, its sail catching the early light as it glided toward the harbor with a strange quietness. Word traveled quickly through the palace corridors that Prince Paris was returning, and as the vessel drew nearer, the servants hurried to prepare a welcome suitable for a royal son. Music drifted from the courtyards, and garlands of flowers were draped near the harbor steps. Troy embodied a city at ease, unaware that it stood at the threshold of a storm. Cassandra watched the scene unfold from one of the palace balconies. She felt no excitement. Instead, an uneasiness rippled through her like a cold wind beneath warm sunlight. Something about the ship disturbed her, although she could not yet see its passengers clearly. The visions pressed themselves upon her mind again, faint at first, then more violently. She saw flames licking the base of the city walls. She saw soldiers pouring through the gates. She saw the palace in ruins and the sea stained with ash. The images twisted and folded over one another until she grasped the railing for support. As the ship approached, Cassandra felt pressure behind her eyes, as if the visions themselves had weight. A figure began to appear at the bow of the vessel. Paris stood tall and handsome, crowned by the pride of youth. Yet Cassandra's gaze was drawn not to her brother, but to the woman who stepped forward beside him, Helen. Her beauty seemed to hold its own light, a brilliance that shimmered even in the muted colors of early dawn. Yet beneath that beauty, Cassandra sensed something sharp and terrible. She felt the future coil itself around this woman like a serpent preparing to strike. The moment Helen's sandals touched the stone steps of Troy's harbor, Cassandra's sight split open with a force that nearly sent her to her knees. She saw two Helens at once, one who smiled with grace and one who screamed amid a battlefield drenched in blood. She saw the two versions of the woman overlap like reflections in shattered glass. In one moment, Helen embraced Paris. In the next, she lay motionless upon the ground. The visions alternated in a rhythm that Cassandra could neither stop nor slow. She tore her gaze away and forced herself to breathe through the rising panic. She had to warn someone. This moment would shape everything that came after. The woman who walked with Paris was not simply a foreign queen. She was the spark that would ignite a future no mortal could withstand. Cassandra hurried down the palace steps, weaving through the gathering crowd. She pressed past servants, guards, and excited citizens until she reached a place where her voice might be heard. She opened her mouth, ready to speak the truth with all the strength she possessed. The words she intended were clear in her mind. She planned to say that Troy must send Helen away immediately. That disaster would follow her arrival, and that Apollo himself had shown Cassandra the burning future that awaited them. The truth was poised on her tongue, yet as she began to speak, the curse took hold with terrible precision. Her warning fractured into a trembling stream of confusion. Her voice rose and fell in tones that conveyed fear, but not meaning. The clarity of her vision dissolved into incoherent pleas. The crowd turned toward her, surprised and troubled by her sudden distress, but no one understood her message. Instead of hearing the truth, they heard the panic of a girl overcome by emotion. Paris approached her with a mixture of annoyance and concern. He placed a steadying hand on her shoulder and told her that she should not frighten the guests. Helen, who had been watching from a short distance, stepped closer with an expression of gentle curiosity. Cassandra tried again, forcing every ounce of determination into her words. She needed Helen to understand. She needed Paris to listen. She needed someone to grasp the future she had witnessed. None of them did. Her voice betrayed her each time she tried to speak. The harder she pushed against the curse, the stronger it became. She felt like a bird beating its wings against the bars of a cage, striking again and again without leaving a mark. In the end, she sank to the ground, trembling from the effort. Her mother and brothers guided her away from the harbor, whispering that she needed rest. They believed she was overwhelmed by excitement or anxiety, not by divine truth. Helen watched her with eyes full of sympathy, not understanding that Cassandra had tried to save her as well. Later that evening, when the celebrations filled the palace halls with laughter and music, Cassandra sat alone in the quiet of the upper terrace. The stars shone brightly above, indifferent to the turmoil within her. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to keep her breath steady. She had seen the beginning of disaster, and she had failed to deliver the warning. The curse tightened around her life with every passing moment, binding her fate to the silence that strangled her words. She looked out over the city, knowing that Troy had welcomed the seed of its own destruction, and that she alone carried certainty of what would follow. Her visions had revealed what lay ahead. Her curse had ensured that no one would believe her, and the gods, watching from distant heights, remained silent. Do not misunderstand this. Cassandra was not loved by the gods, she was consumed by them. The divine is not gentle, it does not cradle, it devours, reshapes, discards. She brushed against power meant to guide sons and shape destinies, and the damage was not metaphorical, it was structural. She did not just lose trust, she lost coherence, and still she kept speaking. That is what makes her story unbearable. The days following Helen's arrival unfolded with deceptive calm. Troy welcomed her with the hospitality expected of a great kingdom, and the palace adjusted swiftly to the presence of its newest guest. Servants carried embroidered linens to her chambers. Musicians gathered to play during the evening meals. The people whispered about her beauty as though she held a blessing rather than a warning. Cassandra walked through these scenes with growing unease. Her visions repeated with relentless clarity. She saw fire consuming the very halls where music now drifted. She saw soldiers advancing down corridors that currently held nothing more threatening than dancers and laughter. Paris was enthralled by Helen, and the palace embraced her as a symbol of Troy's prosperity. Cassandra observed her brother's triumphant smile and felt a coldness settle in her chest. She approached him one afternoon in the courtyard, hoping to speak with him before the celebrations began. Paris greeted her warmly, unaware of the turmoil within her. Cassandra steadied her breath, prepared her thoughts, and attempted once more to deliver the truth. Her curse greeted her immediately. The words that filled her mind with precise clarity dissolved into confusion the moment she tried to speak them. Paris listened with growing frustration. He told her she was imagining threats where none existed, and reminded her that Troy's walls had never been breached. His confidence only deepened as Cassandra struggled to find language that her brother could understand. She felt as though a veil had been drawn permanently between her intention and the world around her. Helen, standing nearby, watched the exchange with gentle concern. She approached Cassandra and spoke with kindness, thanking her for her worries and assuring her that no harm would come from her presence. Cassandra met Helen's gaze and felt the terrible duality of her visions once again. Helen's softness, her grace, and her warmth collided with the violent images of war that Cassandra could not push from her mind. It was as if she stood before a woman whose shadow carried a fate Helen herself could not see. The celebrations continued. The palace glowed with lantern light each evening, and Troy's citizens enjoyed feasts in honor of their returning prince. Cassandra watched from the edges of these gatherings, her face composed but her thoughts restless. She no longer attempted to interrupt the festivities. Her voice would not deliver the truth she held. The curse had sealed her warnings in a prison of distortion, and the more she resisted, the more the distortion twisted her words into meaninglessness. One morning, she rose before dawn and returned to the temple in search of solitude. She hoped that the sacred walls might offer clarity or guidance, yet the moment she entered, the remnants of the divine presence stirred again. The air grew heavy, and she felt the familiar warmth of Apollo. She stood in the center of the chamber with her hands clasped tightly together, fighting the instinct to flee. The god materialized slowly. The radiance around him dimmed in consideration of her fear. "You have tried to speak," he said, reading the tension in her posture. "You have attempted to bend your fate. It is not yours to bend." Cassandra lifted her chin, though her voice trembled. "They need to understand what is coming. They need to know." Apollo regarded her with a calm patience that held no comfort. "The future is not changed by the words of a single mortal. It is shaped by forces far beyond your reach. You have seen what must happen." Cassandra felt anger spark inside her. She stepped forward, despite the weight of his presence. "You showed me a city burning. You showed me death and suffering. It does not need to happen. They could act. They could prevent it, if only they believed me." Apollo's glow intensified. "The truth I placed within you exists beyond their ability to accept. You speak what is real, but they hear what they can bear. This is the nature of mortals. They cling to comfort until it is torn from their hands." Cassandra felt her breath catch. "Then why give me sight at all, if you would deny me the power to act upon it?" The god's expression remained unchanged. "Because witnessing is your purpose." The words fell between them with a finality that struck her like a blow. Witnessing was not saving. Witnessing was not changing. Witnessing was enduring. Cassandra turned away from him, her heart tightening with a sorrow deeper than she had ever known. The god did not stop her. His light dimmed slightly, as though he had already weighed the consequences of her despair and accepted them. When she stepped outside, the sun had risen fully. The city stretched peacefully before her, unaware of the doom approaching. The scent of fresh bread drifted from the marketplace. Children raced across the courtyard. The sea shimmered with quiet beauty. Cassandra watched it all with the certainty that every moment she witnessed was already marked by its own ruin. She returned to the palace with slow steps, carrying the truth alone. She had been given a vision too large for mortal minds, and she had been given a curse too precise to overcome. The gods had chosen her as a vessel, not as a savior. Troy walked steadily toward its future, and Cassandra walked with it, unseen and unheard, holding the weight of a world that refused to believe her. Rumors of unrest beyond Troy's borders began as distant murmurs, carried by merchants who traveled with guarded expressions and lowered voices. They spoke of Greek kings uniting their armies, of ships gathering like storm clouds near the edge of the sea, and of omens that suggested the gods themselves were preparing for conflict. At first, these whispers were dismissed as exaggerated tales, meant to elevate the significance of ordinary disputes. Troy's walls were strong, and its people believed themselves protected by the favor of the divine. Cassandra listened from the palace steps as traders recounted their stories. While those around her debated the truth of these rumors, Cassandra felt their certainty as sharply as if the future stood beside her. Her visions had already shown her the rise of the Greek army, and the fear that clung to those who spoke of war only confirmed what she already knew. The threat did not approach gradually. It pressed against the horizon like a tide gaining strength. One evening, as the sun descended in a wash of muted gold, Hector returned from patrol with a gravity Cassandra had not seen in him before. He carried himself with the calm discipline of a soldier, but his eyes betrayed his concern. He entered the hall to speak with Priam, and Cassandra followed at a careful distance, unwilling to intrude yet compelled by the weight of what she sensed. Hector reported that Greek ships had been sighted moving along the coastline. They sailed not as scattered travelers, but as an organized fleet. Priam listened in silence. The king's face remained steady, though his clasped hands grew visibly tense. Cassandra watched him from the archway and felt the pull of another vision forming behind her eyes. Before she could prepare herself, the sight overtook her. She saw the beaches littered with Greek armor. She saw warriors gathering in lines that stretched beyond the limits of vision. She saw Troy enclosed not by one enemy, but by many. The images pressed against her mind in rapid succession until she gripped the stone wall beside her for support. She blinked, and the vision receded, leaving her breathless and pale. She stepped forward into the hall, intending once more to warn her father, but the curse struck as swiftly as a hawk descending upon its prey. Her voice cracked as she attempted to speak. The urgent clarity she carried collapsed into strained sounds, and the more she struggled to push the words into sense, the more distorted they became. Priam turned to her with sorrow and confusion. He placed a gentle hand upon her shoulder and asked her to rest, rather than to burden herself further with fears she could not explain. Hector watched his sister with a deeper understanding than most. He sensed her suffering, although he did not grasp its cause. He escorted her from the hall with a protective hand on her back and spoke in a voice that carried both warmth and weariness. He told her that fear had a way of shaping visions in the minds of those who worried for their families. He told her that Troy had stood for generations and that it would continue to stand. Cassandra tried to respond, but her thoughts remained trapped behind the barrier of the curse, unable to reach those who needed to hear them most. That night, the city hummed with a quiet tension. Soldiers prepared their armor. Priests offered prayers to Apollo, Zeus, and Athena. The people moved through the streets with a mix of excitement and dread. Cassandra walked among them and felt the future pressing closer with every passing hour. The visions awakened once again, showing her the arrival of the Greeks upon the shores of Troy. She saw them landing in waves, their shields gleaming in the pale morning light. She saw the first spear thrown. She saw the first scream break across the battlefield. The sensations were so vivid that she staggered, certain she could smell the iron tang of blood in the air. She sought solitude near the outer gardens, where the scent of pomegranates and cedar trees offered a reprieve from the turmoil in her mind. She knelt beside the roots of an old tree and tried to steady her breathing. She felt the world narrowing around her as the visions continued to rise, one after another. The future no longer approached in distant glimpses. It pressed directly against her, demanding acknowledgement she could not escape. Cassandra closed her eyes and felt the city's fate descend upon her like the closing of a gate. She tried to convince herself that perhaps the gods would show mercy, that perhaps the visions were warnings meant to be heeded. Yet deep within her she sensed the truth with awful certainty. The gods had set the path. Apollo had delivered the sight. The curse had sealed her voice. Troy walked steadily into the arms of war. Cassandra watched, powerless to alter its course, and felt the first tremor of despair that would soon grow into something far more consuming. The storm she had foreseen was no longer forming. It had already begun. There are places in history where the divine and mortal worlds touch. They are never clean intersections. They are ruptures. Cassandra lived inside one of those ruptures. She felt the war long before Troy did. She never had the luxury of denial. Imagine knowing that fire is coming and being forced to watch people gather tinder. Imagine seeing every wound before it is delivered. Imagine knowing your world is dying and your voice only hastens your isolation. That is the shape of her existence. At dawn, the horizon darkened with the shape of approaching sails. The sea, usually quiet in the early hours, carried the heavy rhythm of oars striking water in unison. From the palace walls, the people of Troy gathered to watch the silhouettes grow larger. The fleet moved with the precision of a single organism, each ship aligned with the next, each sail catching the wind in perfect formation. There was no mistaking the purpose of their arrival. The Greeks had come. A hush fell across the battlements as the first ships reached the shallows. Warriors leapt into the surf with shields raised high. Their armor gleamed like hammered gold beneath the rising sun, and their war cries echoed against the cliffs with a force that made the ground tremble. Troy had witnessed battles before, but nothing in its memory matched the scale of the army now assembling on its shores. Cassandra stood behind the soldiers on the wall. Her gaze drifted not across the battlefield, but inward to the space where her visions took root. She felt them building with such intensity that the world around her seemed to dim. She saw flames where there were none. She saw towers collapsing, though they remained intact. She saw the fall of the city as vividly as she saw the scaffolding of its living architecture. The duality pressed her mind to its limits, as if she existed in two realities at once. When the first Greek spear pierced the sand, she staggered back, overcome by the echo of a vision she had seen too many times to count. The soldiers around her did not notice. They were focused on the armies forming below. The Greeks moved forward with practiced discipline, their shields locking together into a wall of bronze. The Trojan forces surged to meet them with a shout that rolled across the field like thunder. Cassandra's hands trembled as she tried once more to warn those near her. Her throat tightened with urgency. The message that burned within her threatened to break her voice apart. She spoke with all the clarity she could muster, but the curse seized her intention and tore it into confusion. The soldier closest to her frowned and shook his head, unable to understand what she attempted to convey. Her distress earned her nothing more than a sympathetic glance before he returned his attention to the looming battle. The tide of war rushed forward with crushing force. The clang of metal against metal filled the air. The cries of the wounded rose like a dirge. Cassandra watched the chaos unfold and felt the overwhelming weight of the future pressing against her chest. She knew the siege would not end with the first clash of blades, nor with the second. She saw years of suffering stretching ahead, years in which the city's strength would falter inch by inch. Troy would stand for long enough to believe in hope, yet fall with the certainty of a prophecy already fulfilled. As the battle raged, a priest approached her, guiding her away from the wall. His expression contained both gentleness and concern. He told her that the sight of war was too much for a young woman. He told her that she should pray for peace rather than consume herself with fear. Cassandra listened without responding. She felt disconnected from his reassurances. The war she saw before her was not the war he perceived. He saw the clash of armies. She saw the unraveling of destiny. The priest led her to the temple courtyard, where the smoke of incense drifted in frail spirals. She stood before the altar, yet found no solace. The sunlight filtered through the pillars in soft ribbons, but even the beauty of the temple could not ease the weight she carried. She felt the presence of Apollo stirring in the recesses of the sanctuary, and she stepped back instinctively. She remembered the moment he had placed the visions within her. She remembered the sharpness of his gaze and the certainty with which he spoke of fate. She understood now that his intentions had never aligned with mercy or guidance. He had chosen her as a witness to the destruction he refused to prevent. He had bound her to a future that would offer her no power except the torment of foresight. As the sounds of battle drifted through the air, Cassandra bowed her head and closed her eyes. The visions came again, rising unbidden like a storm. She saw Hector confronting the greatest of the Greek warriors. She saw Paris trembling as he faced consequences he had never anticipated. She saw her own life stretched across paths she could not escape. Each image felt more vivid than the last. When she opened her eyes, the battle had begun to move inland. Troy was no longer watching the war from a distance. It was standing in the heart of it. The priests called for prayers, the soldiers called for weapons, the people called for courage. Cassandra remained silent. She had already seen the end, long before the beginning had arrived. The first battle did not end the war. It merely opened a wound that refused to close. The Greeks established their camp along the shoreline and settled into a relentless siege that stretched far beyond the expectations of either side. Seasons turned, and Troy found itself caught in a cycle of violence and uneasy silences. The once vibrant city adapted to the rhythms of conflict, though its people clung to hope with a determination born from desperation rather than faith. Cassandra grew older beneath the weight of unending visions. She watched Troy shift from a city of celebration to a fortress of survival. The markets remained open, but their stalls grew thinner. The laughter that once filled the palace corridors became rarer, replaced by the cautious footsteps of those who carried news from the battlefield. At night, the fires along the Greek encampment glowed like a string of fallen stars, reminding everyone of the enemy who never slept. The curse that silenced Cassandra's warnings tightened its hold with every passing month. Her visions grew sharper and more frequent, punctuating her days with flashes of devastation. She saw battles before they were fought. She saw the fates of soldiers long before their names were mourned. She saw her brothers at the center of futures marked by triumph and tragedy. Each new sight carved itself into her mind with a clarity that left her shaken. She attempted again and again to speak these truths, but the curse remained absolute. When she tried to warn a soldier that he would not survive the next day's battle, Her voice carried only trembling urgency. When she attempted to tell her father that the southern gate would be struck before sunrise, her words slipped into confusion. She felt as if she lived between two worlds, one where fate unfolded with cruel precision, and one where she remained powerless to alter its course. Despite her silence, those closest to her could not ignore the tension in her eyes or the heaviness in her voice when she tried to speak. Some believed she suffered from the strain of living through war. Others assumed she carried personal grief. A few, mostly servants and children, whispered that she was touched by the gods, though they could not decide if it was a blessing or a curse. No one understood that she carried knowledge more burdensome than any mortal should bear. Hector remained the pillar of Trojan strength. Cassandra watched him march through the city each morning, his presence a steady reassurance to those who feared the worst. She admired his courage, yet her visions often filled her with dread when she looked at him. She saw him standing before a warrior whose armor shone like the sun. She saw the dust rising around them. She saw Hector fall. She tried again and again to warn him, but her words dissolved each time into fragments that carried fear, but no meaning. He would place his hand gently on her shoulder and tell her that she worried too much. She would nod, unable to bridge the distance between what she knew and what he believed. One evening, as the sun sank behind the hills and cast long shadows across the fields, Cassandra saw a new vision forming. It began with the sound of a distant cry, then sharpened into images that unfolded with relentless speed. She saw the Greek champion Achilles striding across the battlefield with a fury that thundered against the earth. She saw Hector running to meet him, determination etched into his stance. She saw the two men clash with a force that seemed to shake the sky. The sight grew sharper until it rested on the moment of Hector's fall, the moment Troy would lose its greatest protector. Cassandra collapsed against a column as the vision faded, her breath ragged and her hands trembling. She knew she could not allow the future to unfold without warning Hector once more. She found him preparing his armor near the stables. The sun glinted off the polished surface of his shield as he looked up to greet her. His expression softened when he saw the distress on her face. This time she tried not to plead. She tried not to force the truth through her broken voice. She placed both hands over his and looked into his eyes with a depth that asked him to understand without explanation. She spoke slowly, carefully, fighting against the curse that twisted her meaning. She told him he must not go. She told him he would not return if he faced Achilles. She told him that she saw death approaching. Hector listened with patience, but the curse worked its cruelty once more. He heard only a sister overwhelmed by fear, rather than a prophet delivering truth. He smiled gently, reassured her, and told her that every soldier faced risk in war. He promised he would be careful. He promised he would return. Cassandra felt the truth crumble within her chest as the curse robbed her of the language that might have saved him. She watched him ride into battle the next morning, his cloak flowing behind him like a banner. She stood upon the palace walls, her fingers gripping the stone until her knuckles whitened. She saw the battle unfold in the distance. She saw Achilles advancing. She saw the duel she had foreseen. The vision had become reality. When Hector fell, the world seemed to still. The cries of the soldiers reached her on the wind. The city below her shuddered with grief. Cassandra sank to her knees, her breath leaving her in a quiet gasp. She had witnessed the future countless times, but the moment it became true had never felt more devastating. Troy mourned its prince. Cassandra mourned the proof that her visions had never lied. She remained on the wall long after the battlefield grew silent. The sun descended behind the hills, casting the sky in deep shades of bronze and crimson. Cassandra understood with painful clarity that Troy had crossed the threshold from which he could not return. The fall had begun. The death of Hector rippled through Troy with a force that altered the spirit of the city. His loss did not simply remove a warrior from the battlefield. It removed the steady heart that had held the kingdom together through years of uncertainty. The people moved through the streets as though carrying an invisible weight upon their shoulders. Every step seemed slower. Every voice sounded muted. The walls still stood strong, yet the city's confidence had begun to fracture. Cassandra walked through the palace in the days that followed and felt the remnants of her vision echoing through every hallway. Priam sat in his chambers with grief carved deeply into his expression. Hecuba spent her hours in prayer, pleading with the gods to protect what remained of her family. Paris moved through the palace like a shadow, shaken by the price of conflict he had helped ignite. Cassandra watched them all with a sorrow that grew heavier the longer she saw the future continue its unrelenting approach. The Greeks honored Hector's death with renewed fury. Their assaults became more frequent, and their strategies grew more ruthless. The air filled each morning with the sound of war horns. The nights glowed with the fires of distant camps. The fields surrounding Troy, once filled with grazing animals and scattered wildflowers, had become a landscape marked by scars of battle and the remnants of fallen soldiers. Cassandra spent more time in the temple as the war intensified. She did not go to seek comfort, for she knew the gods offered none. She went because the weight of her visions had become too much to carry alone. She knelt before the altar, with her hands clasped tightly, and her eyes closed, not in prayer, but in quiet endurance. She felt the presence of Apollo press against the edges of the chamber, observing her with a detached interest that stirred neither fear nor comfort, but instead a painful awareness of her place in the order he had created. One afternoon, as she stood near the threshold of the temple, a new vision gathered within her mind. It began not with fire or screams, but with an object. She saw wood carved into the shape of a great beast. She saw the grain of its surface glimmer in the torchlight. She saw its massive form standing silently before the city gates, as if offering itself in surrender. The horse. The image sharpened until she could see the shadows within it. They shifted and breathed like living creatures. She felt her heartbeat quicken as she understood the gravity of the vision. It was not a symbol. It was not a metaphor. It was a warning so clear that even her cursed voice could not alter its truth. She rushed back to the palace and found her father speaking with his advisors. She begged for their attention with a force she had never displayed before. Her urgency drew their gaze. She opened her mouth to speak, confident that the warning could not be mistaken. The curse tightened its grip immediately. Her voice emerged as strained and chaotic. Her words tangled into sounds that carried emotion but lacked meaning. The advisors exchanged uneasy glances. Priam stepped toward her and placed his hands gently upon her arms. He asked her to breathe. He told her that the stress of the war had become too much, that she needed rest, and that the gods would not abandon Troy. Cassandra stared at him with a grief so profound that she could not respond. The truth she held had become a barrier that no intention could overcome. She turned away before they could attempt to offer comfort and walked through the corridors with steps that felt unsteady. Her vision lingered before her eyes, refusing to fade. She saw the walls opening to receive the wooden structure. She saw the people of Troy celebrating its arrival. She saw the interior of the horse shift with hidden movement. She knew precisely what lay inside. She stopped near a window overlooking the courtyard and pressed her hand against the cool stone. The air felt heavy, even the sky seemed dim. She closed her eyes and felt the future stretching before her with a certainty that could not be altered. Troy did not recognize the danger approaching him. The people saw only a symbol of Greek surrender. They saw a miracle, Cassandra saw the instrument of their undoing. As the days passed, her visions grew more frequent and more painful. She saw the night the Greeks would emerge from the horse. She saw the gates opening from within. She saw the torchlight rising. She saw the city falling. Each image carved itself deeper into her memory, until she felt as though she were living the destruction long before it arrived. She remained silent when she passed others in the palace, not because she lacked the desire to speak, but because she knew her voice could no longer protect them. The curse had severed the path between her truth and their understanding. All that remained was the burden of witnessing what she could not change. Cassandra stood upon the walls one evening, watching the sun descend behind the distant hills. The sea reflected the colors of dusk in soft hues of gold and crimson. It was a beautiful sight, yet it carried a weight that pressed upon her heart. She felt the future moving toward her, like a tide that neither storm nor prayer could reverse. She did not know exactly when the horse would come. She only knew that it would arrive. She knew that Troy would welcome it. She knew that the city would seal its own fate. And she knew that she would watch it all, powerless to alter a single moment. The gods had written the ending, and her life had become the script. Gap. The night before the deception began, Troy rested beneath a stillness that felt unnatural. The sea lay flat and silent, reflecting the pale moonlight in a sheet of silver. Even the winds seemed hesitant to move through the city streets. Cassandra sensed the shift immediately. She felt it settle into her bones with the same certainty she felt in every vision. Something significant had changed beyond the horizon, and the air carried the tension of an unseen presence waiting to reveal itself. At dawn, a cry rose from the soldiers stationed along the eastern wall. Cassandra heard the sound and moved toward the battlements with a sense of dread winding tightly within her. She climbed the narrow stone steps and pushed through the crowd of guards until she reached a place where she could see the field below. The Greek camp had vanished. The shoreline stood empty, marked only by the blackened remains of previous battles. The tents, the armor, the standards, and the watchfires were gone. Soldiers murmured in disbelief. Some spoke of retreat. Others believed the gods had intervened in Troy's favor. Cassandra felt none of their relief. The sight before her carried a familiarity that pierced through her chest. She had seen this emptiness in her visions, and she knew exactly what it meant. Her gaze drifted toward the center of the field, where a massive structure stood. It rose from the earth like an unnatural monument, towering above the surrounding landscape. Its shape was unmistakable, crafted with the precision of seasoned builders. The surface of the wooden horse gleamed beneath the early light, polished smooth and carved with symbols that mimicked reverence. A murmur passed through the soldiers around her as they recognized it. Some expressed awe, others questioned its purpose. Cassandra felt her breath quicken as she watched the horse stand in perfect stillness, its hollow interior hidden behind a layer of artistry that disguised its true nature. The advisors rushed to Priam with their interpretations. They claimed the horse was an offering to the gods, a symbol of Greek surrender, or a tribute meant to honor Troy's resilience. The priests examined it with curiosity, impressed by the craftsmanship, and convinced that destroying such a gift might invite divine displeasure. Word of the offering spread through the city, and by midday, citizens had gathered near the gates to witness the strange marvel. Cassandra moved through the crowd with urgency burning inside her. She pushed past the onlookers until she reached the front of the gathering. The sight of the horse loomed above her, immense and silent. She felt the heat of the visions rising once more. She saw soldiers hidden within the structure. She saw them waiting for the night. She saw the gates opening from within. She saw Troy burning. She turned to face the people and attempted to speak. Her voice trembled with the weight of truth, but the curse immediately twisted her intentions. Her warning emerged as a disjointed sound. Her pleas dissolved into confusion. The crowd watched her with a mixture of pity and discomfort. Some gently urged her to step back. Others whispered that her visions had grown too heavy for her mind. Priam approached with solemn grace and placed a hand on Cassandra's shoulder. He told her that the gods had sent Troy a sign of victory. He told her that the horse represented the Greeks' surrender. He told her that they should honor the gift rather than fear it. Cassandra shook her head with urgency, but her voice refused her. The words that would have saved the city had been stripped of meaning, leaving her trapped in a silence more crushing than any quiet she had known. The council met shortly afterward. Their decision came swiftly. The horse would be brought into the city as a symbol of triumph. The people erupted in celebration. They decorated the streets with garlands. They sang songs of victory. They proclaimed that the years of siege had ended and that peace had finally come. Cassandra watched the festivities with hollow eyes. She felt the future moving toward her with unstoppable force. She stood upon the walls as the soldiers hauled the massive structure through the gates. The wheels creaked beneath its weight. The ropes strained. The people cheered. Cassandra felt tears rise as she watched the horse pass beneath the archway, sealing the fate she had foreseen for so long. When evening arrived, the celebrations grew louder. Wine flowed generously. Music echoed through the streets. Families gathered in their homes and gave thanks to the gods for their deliverance. Cassandra walked through the city and felt as though she were moving through a dream carved from the future's cruelest truths. Her visions hovered before her eyes with such clarity that she could not separate them from the present. She saw the gates unlocking. She saw the soldiers emerging from the hollow interior. She saw the torches lighting the night. She saw the screams. She saw the fire. She saw the end. She returned to the upper walls and watched the city below her settle into the false comfort of celebration. Her hands gripped the stone as she felt the curse tighten once more. Her entire life had led to this moment. She felt the weight of it in her chest, heavy and unyielding. The horse stood silent in the center of Troy like a watching sentinel. Cassandra understood that she had crossed the final threshold. Troy was no longer walking toward its fate. It had already opened its gates to welcome it inside. Night settled over Troy with a deceptive gentleness. The stars appeared with unusual clarity, scattered across the sky like distant watchful eyes. A soft breeze drifted between the buildings, carrying with it the faint scent of the sea. The city felt calm in a way that made Cassandra's skin tighten with dread. Troy believed it had triumphed. Music drifted from the courtyards. Laughter echoed through the narrow streets. Families lingered at their doorways to enjoy the cool air after the warmth of the day had passed. Cassandra did not join them. She stood alone on the highest terrace of the palace, watching the massive wooden horse that loomed in the center of the city. It cast a long shadow in the moonlight, a shadow too deep to belong to anything created for peace. She observed it with the same certainty she had carried since the first moment it appeared. She knew it was not merely an object of carved wood. It was a vessel for an ending that had been written long before she was born. The soldiers guarding the courtyard grew relaxed as the night deepened. They spoke softly among themselves, convinced the Greeks had abandoned the war. Some leaned against the stone walls, grateful for the quiet that followed years of battle. Others joked about returning home. Cassandra listened to their voices and felt a hollow ache rising within her. She wished she could have been wrong. She wished her visions had been fragments of dreams rather than truths carved by gods. As the hour grew late, the city's lights dimmed. One by one, the torches along the streets sputtered and died. The palace grew quiet. The sounds of music faded until the night held only the soft murmur of distant conversation. Cassandra leaned forward, sensing the shift in the air. The world felt as though it had drawn a single breath and then refused to release it. She saw movement inside the horse. It was subtle at first, a faint vibration along the wooden surface. She narrowed her eyes, her heart pounding as the truth of her vision stepped into the present. The wooden belly of the horse creaked. A sliver of darkness moved, then another. Cassandra gripped the railing with both hands, unable to tear her gaze away. The hatch opened. A shadow descended quietly, then another. The soldiers inside the horse dropped to the ground with practiced silence. They moved like creatures born from darkness, rather than men forged in war. Their armor caught the faint moonlight in thin silver traces, revealing the precision of their purpose. They signaled to the next set of warriors, and soon the courtyard filled with silent, deadly movement. Cassandra rushed down the terraces, her steps swift and uneven. She reached the palace threshold and burst into the hall, her voice rising in a cry that the curse immediately twisted. Her warnings again dissolved into a frantic sound that carried fear but no clarity. The guards stared at her in confusion, unsure if they should restrain her or comfort her. They did not understand the urgency behind her trembling hands. While they hesitated, the Greeks lit their first torches. A thin line of fire illuminated the square. It grew brighter as more torches were lit. The orange glow flickered across the stones like the tongue of a waking flame. The Greeks spread through the city with silent coordination. Cassandra pushed past the guards and ran toward the outer walls. She reached the courtyard in time to see the first building ignite. Flame blossomed upward with terrible speed. It consumed the lower beams, climbed the walls, and broke through the roof in a rush of sparks. The screams began. A household woke to find their home burning. A soldier shouted for his captain. A woman fled through the street with her child in her arms. The city's quiet was shattered beneath a rising chorus of panic. Cassandra stood frozen for a moment, unable to breathe as she watched her visions unfold in exact detail. The fire spread with terrifying ease. The Greeks moved through the streets with the relentless confidence of men who believed in destiny. Cassandra raced toward the palace to find her family. Her feet struck the stone steps in a frantic rhythm. She shouted for her mother, her father, and her brothers, but her voice remained unusable. She found Hecuba first, shielding two younger children behind her. The queen's eyes widened when she saw the flames rising beyond the palace gates. She gathered the children in her arms and urged Cassandra to stay close. The palace erupted in chaos. Servants rushed through the halls with buckets of water. Soldiers ran toward the walls. The distant clang of battle filled the air. Cassandra turned her head toward the sky, which had begun to glow with streaks of red and gold. The fire rose like a living creature, devouring everything in its path. She had seen this moment so many times that it felt like a memory rather than an unfolding event. She moved through the palace with her family as the screams grew louder. The smoke thickened, the torches flickered. The city that had once stood proud and impenetrable had become a labyrinth of flame and terror. Somewhere beyond the palace gates, she could hear the steady march of the Greek army as it poured through the night, answering the call of a future that had long awaited them. Cassandra felt the world closing around her like the final lines of a script written by divine hands. Troy had entered its last hour, and she carried every moment of its destruction inside her as clearly as if she had lived it before. The flames spread through Troy with a force that consumed everything in their path. Smoke curled upward in thick spirals that blotted the stars from the sky. The palace trembled beneath the weight of collapsing beams, and the air filled with the sharp scent of burning cedar and cracked stone. Cassandra moved through the corridors with her mother and the younger children, her heart pounding as the walls she had known all her life groaned with the strain of approaching ruin. Priam gathered what remained of the royal family near the central hall, though the structure itself shook under the assault of fire and invading soldiers. Cassandra saw the terror etched into the faces around her, but she felt a strange calm settle over her spirit. The moment she had foreseen since her childhood had finally arrived, and the reality of it carried a weight more familiar than frightening. She knew which directions would soon be overrun. She knew which walls would fall first. She knew where the Greeks would enter, and she knew how little time remained. The sounds of swords clashing filled the halls. The screams of the wounded echoed through the air. Cassandra felt the world narrowing around her, the future and present aligning so precisely that they felt like the same moment. She moved beside her mother, guiding the children toward the upper chambers, yet her mind drifted toward the sanctuary she had seen again and again in her visions, the Temple of Athena. It stood at the highest point of the palace, its stone walls strengthened by centuries of worship. Cassandra knew the sanctuary would be the final refuge Troy offered before its collapse. She also knew that the safety it promised was only temporary. She took her mother's hand and urged her forward, pointing toward the ancient staircase that curved along the wall. Hecuba hesitated only briefly before leading the children upward, trusting Cassandra's urgency, even if she could not understand her words. They reached the temple as a new wave of fire swept across the courtyard below. The sanctuary door stood open, illuminated by the flickering light of a single torch. The statue of Athena towered above the altar, her marble eyes fixed in an expression of serene vigilance. Cassandra felt a tightening in her chest as she entered the space. The visions she had carried since childhood had always brought her to this room, and the familiarity of it struck her with quiet finality. The air inside the temple was cooler than the burning halls below. The stone walls muffled the noise of destruction, creating an eerie quiet that felt removed from the chaos beyond. Cassandra guided her family to the center of the sanctuary, where the shadows softened beneath Athena's gaze. Hecuba gathered the children close, whispering prayers with trembling lips. Priam stood at the entrance, his posture rigid, his expression heavy with grief and resignation. Cassandra moved toward the statue and placed her hand upon the cold marble base. She closed her eyes and felt the remnants of a vision rise within her. It came not as a violent rush, but as a quiet unfolding, like a page turning in a book long familiar. She saw the Greeks approaching the sanctuary. She saw the swords drawn. She saw the moment when the last flame would rise. She saw herself standing exactly where she was now. She opened her eyes and met the gaze of the goddess. For a fleeting moment, she wondered if the gods ever felt remorse for the suffering woven into their designs. She wondered if Athena had watched Troy's fall with the same inevitability Apollo had shown her. Yet the statue remained silent, carved in stone and untouched by the desperation of those who knelt before it. The sanctuary door burst open. Greek soldiers entered with the swift precision of men accustomed to victory. Their armor shone in the torchlight, casting sharp reflections across the marble floor. Priam stepped forward with dignity, though Cassandra saw the shock in his eyes as the soldiers approached. The children cried out and clung to their mother. Cassandra felt the world slowing around her, the future aligning with each movement before it happened. She stepped aside and watched the scene unfold with solemn acceptance. She had seen it too many times to react with surprise. She witnessed her father's final moment. She witnessed the cries that followed. She witnessed the soldiers moving toward the altar with unrelenting purpose. She witnessed it all as if she were standing outside her own body, a silent spectator to the end she had carried within her for so long. The sanctuary dimmed as smoke seeped through the cracks. The flames outside roared with renewed intensity. Cassandra moved closer to the statue of Athena and closed her eyes once more. She felt the weight of her life settle around her like a cloak. The curse that had defined her existence held no more secrets. The truth that had isolated her now enveloped her completely. She knelt at the base of the statue and let her breath steady. She felt neither fear nor anger. She felt only a quiet understanding. Troy had fallen as she had always known he would. The gods had written the ending long before this night. Her fate had not been to save her people, but to bear witness to their final hours. The soldiers approached her with measured steps. She did not resist. The vision had been fulfilled, and Cassandra, the prophet who had carried the truth without ever being heard, met her fate with the calm of someone who had lived it many times before. The fires of Troy burned long into the night. By dawn, the smoke rose in heavy columns that blurred the horizon and extinguished the once familiar shape of the palace towers. The sea carried the reflection of the flames across its surface like a shroud draped over the water. The cries that had filled the streets had fallen quiet. Only the crackle of dying embers and the distant murmur of Greek voices remained. Cassandra's final moments unfolded with the solemn clarity of a truth she had carried all her life. Though fear surged through the survivors who cowered in the ruins, she felt none of it. The knowledge of her fate had lived within her for so long that the reality of its arrival came as a strange, almost peaceful inevitability. The curse had shaped her existence since childhood. It had taken her voice. It had taken her trust. It had taken her city. There was nothing left for it to unmake. The soldiers approached her as she knelt at Athena's altar. Their footsteps echoed through the sanctuary, breaking the fragile quiet of the marble chamber. Cassandra did not rise. She looked up at the goddess instead, her eyes reflecting the steady composure of someone who had been living at the edge of this moment for years. The statue's gaze remained fixed and unchanging, offering neither protection nor condemnation. When the soldiers reached her, she lifted her head slightly. She did not plead, and she did not attempt to speak. Her voice had never been the instrument of her truth. It had been the boundary that defined her isolation. Her silence now carried a deeper meaning than anything she might have said. She met the soldiers' eyes without anger or fear. In their presence, she felt only resignation, a surrender not to them, but to the unfolding of fate itself. The sanctuary fell quiet after they left. The marble floor bore new shadows, and the air hung heavy with the finality of what had occurred. Outside, the fire continued to spread through the remains of Troy, devouring the homes, the temples, and the memories of a city that had once believed itself invincible. Cassandra's family, her people, and her city had been drawn into the ending the gods had written. The prophecy had fulfilled itself in the precise manner she had foreseen. When morning arrived, the light that filtered through the smoke cast the ruins in muted shades of gray and gold. The once great city lay silent beneath the subtle shimmer of ash that drifted through the air. The Greeks moved through the remnants with the methodical movements of conquerors, claiming trophies from the fallen and gathering the survivors. Among the ruins, Cassandra's presence lingered as though she remained part of the city's memory. The curse that had isolated her in life had taken nothing from what she represented in death. She had carried the truth when no one else could see it. She had endured the burden of knowledge that would have broken others. She had lived in the space between vision and belief, between truth and silence, between the gods and the mortals they governed. Her story would not be told by those who had known her, for the voices of Troy had been smothered by fire. yet her name would continue beyond the ruins. It would travel in whispers carried by those who had survived the war. It would live in the echoes of the walls that once breathed with the whispers she alone could hear. It would take shape in the stories shared generations later, stories of a woman who saw the future and suffered because she was not believed. In the centuries to come, Cassandra would become a symbol of truth, spoken into deaf ears. Her curse would be remembered not as a failing, but as a tragedy woven by divine hands. Her voice, silenced in life, would resound in history as a caution against the blindness of those who choose comfort over truth. Troy turned to ash, but Cassandra's story endured. You have walked with her through the smoke and the ruin. You have witnessed the truth she carried, the curse she endured, and the fall she could not prevent. Now, as the last embers of Troy fade into memory, you may wonder why her story has survived, while so many others have vanished into the dust. It survived because suffering recognizes itself across time. It survived because truth, even when silenced, insists on being remembered. Cassandra's life became a lesson that humanity has never fully learned. People turn away from what frightens them. They refuse the warnings that threaten their comfort. They dismiss the voices that speak too clearly. They repeat this mistake generation after generation, never understanding that disbelief is a kind of blindness. And blindness is a doorway through which tragedy enters without resistance. I have seen this pattern in every age. Civilizations rise, confident in their certainties, then stumble into ruin because they ignored the voices that stood alone. Cassandra was not the first to suffer this fate, and she was not the last. Yet her story endures because it reveals something universal. She carried a truth that was larger than herself. She carried it even when it shattered her voice. She carried it even when her visions became a burden heavier than despair. People often call her tragic. They do not understand what tragedy truly means. Tragedy is not suffering alone. Tragedy is knowing before anyone else that suffering is coming and being powerless to prevent it. Cassandra lived in that space between clarity and helplessness. That was her curse. That was her gift. That was the burden the gods placed upon her without mercy. If you listen closely, you may sense her story echoing beyond the fall of Troy. It lingers not in the ruins, but in the questions it leaves behind. What good is truth in a world that refuses to hear it? What becomes of a voice denied belief? What happens when sight is given without the power to act? These questions drift through every era, as persistent as the whisper of wind through broken stone. Cassandra's voice was silenced, yet the silence did not erase her. It amplified her. Her story lives because the world continues to repeat the same mistakes, and every repetition sharpens the memory of the ones who tried to warn it. She could not save her city, but she has taught countless generations to look more carefully at the truths they would prefer to ignore. Now her tale rests with you. Carry it with the respect that truth deserves. Remember her not as a myth, but as a witness abandoned by the world she tried to save. Remember that her greatest burden was not prophecy, but disbelief. Her story remains because it must. And I remain because stories such as hers require someone to keep them from fading. I watch. I remember. And now that you have heard her, you will remember too.